So, hi everyone. As Munir said, my name is Glen Kurokawa, and I am from CRU Fertilizers. So we are a group of about 20 to 30 individuals. Most of us are based in London, but we also have offices in China, India, and the United States. And as he's noted, I am a phosphate analyst. I mostly study phosphate rock and the NPK markets. But today I'm going to be talking more broadly about the phosphate industry, and specifically what CRU's view is from 2020 to 2024, so the kind of a 5-year span. All right, so I think it's just helpful to just briefly review a simplified view of the phosphate flow. So in 2019, there was about 200 million tons of phosphate, a little bit over 200 million tons of phosphate rock that was produced. Most of that was used to produce phosphoric acid, as you can see in the middle, and most of that was used to produce DAP, MAP, and NPKs. Some of the phosphate resources were also used to make superphosphates, TSP and SSP, as well as some other products. In this presentation, I'll be focusing mostly on the right-hand side, so DAP, MAP, NPKs, and a little bit of superphosphates. So in order to describe and discuss our 5-year view to 2024, I thought it would be useful to kind of break down that question into some smaller questions. And this is not a comprehensive list, obviously, but it addresses some of the main issues, main questions in the medium term. So as you can see, they relate to demand. Some regions, China, India, Europe, and the Americas, and you may see that MENA is missing, and MENA is part of the big capacity story for the next 5 years, and I'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so let's start with demand, because of course there's no phosphate supply without phosphate demand. And so in the last 5 years, phosphate consumption has been pretty good in most regions of the world. However, it has dropped significantly in China, and that has resulted in the global consumption of phosphate to rise only marginally. However, going forward, we expect the Chinese phosphate consumption decline to slow down to 2024. And that's why we expect, and we also expect growth in other regions. So that's why we expect a significantly higher phosphate consumption growth rate for the next 5 years. Now, in terms of the growth regions for phosphate, we think, it's probably not very controversial. I mean, the growth regions that we expect are India, Brazil, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps some other ones. And the reasons for these vary, but it's generally about growing agriculture, especially in Brazil, and growing population, in populations that are becoming richer, and the agricultural inputs that are needed to feed those richer, larger populations in other parts of the world. I talked about how China has been declining, and that has also been mentioned by my colleague Alberto in a little bit more depth. But as he's also mentioned, declining application rates and some other reasons. Another additional reason for the Chinese decline is the substitution to organic and specialty fertilizers and away from bulk phosphate commodity fertilizers. So that's kind of the demand picture. Let's move to some of the regions, starting with China. So here, on the left-hand side, I've got a chart of Chinese capacities for various phosphate commodities. And so you can see that they kind of peaked at around 2016 or so. And we expect them to kind of slow down and decrease a little bit over the coming years. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One reason is because of declining consumption and demand. And of course there's environmental reasons, cost reasons. Another reason is because of the shifting away from phosphate commodities to more specialized phosphate products and other specialty fertilizers. And so one case in point is Sinochem Fuling. This plant is in Chongqing province, and it closed last October, and it had capacities in the blue that you can see in the blue bars on the right-hand chart. And after it relocates due to environmental regulations, it will have less phosphate commodity capacity, as you can see in the orange bars, and it will have more specialty capacities. And that specialty capacity does not necessarily mean it's all phosphate. It includes other things as well. So you can see kind of the shift. And so if most of that other specialty is not phosphate capacity, then the overall phosphate capacity of Sinochem Fulane will decrease. In terms of trade, well, first of all, maybe I should just describe the production here. So from 2019 to 2024, the production share of China is not expected to significantly change. And for exports, which is in the middle chart, is also not expected to change. However, as you can see in the black line, the share of those exports, of total exports around the world, is expected to decline because trade will go up a little bit as we go into 2024. Now you may wonder, well, if there's declining demand in China, wouldn't Chinese producers turn to the export market and increase exports? And we don't think so. One reason is because of increasing costs, and that is what is shown on the right-hand side. So this is for just DAP, but it's kind of similar for other phosphate commodities as well. So Chinese costs, site costs, have overtaken world costs, and they are expected to increase at a faster rate than the rest of the world. All right, so I'm going to move west to India. So what will determine Indian imports in the future? So as you probably know, India has very few phosphate resources, and in fact, it has only one phosphate mine of note, one big mine of note anyways. And that's this, but it imports a lot of phosphate because it has a big, of course, it has a big agricultural sector. So if you took the phosphate production, rock production, and you subtracted phosphate consumption, you can get something like a phosphate balance, which I've shown in the middle of this slide. And this shows that, of course, in North Africa, there's a big phosphate surplus, but at the bottom you'll see that there's a big phosphate deficit in South Asia, and most of that is taken up by India. So India has to import all its phosphate, most of its phosphate requirements, and it imports, as you can see on the right-hand chart, rock as well as acid and DAP. It also imports a little bit of NPKs. So it imports raw materials at both the rock and the acid level, and it can also import finished product. But how does India determine what it imports? So this is very complicated. I've got kind of a cartoon here for DAP. Something similar happens for NPKs, but that's on a smaller scale, so I'm just going to look at DAP. So many DAP manufacturers can import rock and then turn that into acid, and then turn that into DAP and subsequently sell that. So they can also, that would also imply that they can import phosphoric acid, turn it into DAP and sell that, or they can just import DAP finished product directly and sell that. So it's working at different levels, and the way, of course, Indian importers and distributors make the decision is based on relative prices. So for instance, if phosphoric acid prices based on a P2O5 level are fairly high, then they would import less of that and more of, let's say, rock and DAP. At the moment, the margins look like it favors DAP imports and then distributing that, and then second, importing rock and then making finished product from that, and then finally phosphoric acid, because phosphoric acid prices are still high, relatively high on a P2O5 level. Now the relative prices are also, of course, determined by a variety of different factors such as foreign exchange rates, the MRPs, the prices that are set by the Indian producers, subsidies, and so this is a fairly complicated system. There are other factors, of course, like for instance, Indian producers may be locked into long-term raw material procurement contracts. So it's a fairly complex system, and it's going to remain a fairly complex system in the future. Okay, moving west, further west to Europe. So I've got two charts here. You can see one on the left for West Europe and one on the right for East Europe, and these show phosphate imports into these regions. So West Europe, as you can see, has been declining in terms of its phosphate imports, and East Europe has been increasing. And we expect those trends to continue over the medium term to 2024. And as you can see, NPKs are the biggest finished phosphate product that is imported into Europe, both West and East. And then secondly, it is actually rock at the bottom there. And then much of that rock is used to produce NPKs. So NPKs are fairly important to Europe. And in this regard, CRU has, just in December of last year, so December 2019, we've come up with some cost curves for some of the most popular grades of NPKs, including 1515 and 1616. And that's what's shown in the bottom two charts there. And what is striking is that the Russian producers are on the left-hand side of those cost curves in both of these, and to a significant extent. You can see it's like a step change. And of course, the ruble depreciation has something to do with this, as it does for all Russian costs across commodities. But it's also for NPKs because Russian producers have plentiful access to so for natural gas or hydrocarbon resources, they have good phosphate deposits, especially phosagro, and they also have relatively inexpensive potash deposits. So Russian producers have a very big advantage, and they have a lot of them, especially phosagro, have big plans to move more product into Europe, their neighboring market, as well as their strong domestic market. So we expect more Russian products, especially NPKs, to enter the European market and to make that market a little bit more competitive. But it's not all about NPKs in Europe. Europe is really big into environmental initiatives and health initiatives. On the left-hand chart, I've got a map showing some of so Europe has come up with cadmium limits for phosphate fertilizers, which will enter in 2022. And that is what's shown in the EU map. But some countries already have even stricter limits than that. We don't expect this to have a big impact, but it will have an impact on some manufacturers or producers, such as perhaps Senegal, which have fairly high cadmium limits, have high cadmium concentrations in their phosphate deposits. But that's kind of on the west side of Senegal, not the east. So there may be some changes on that front, but perhaps the bigger change is the one shown on the right-hand side. So the EU wants to recycle more phosphate in the future. Some big regulations are going to be coming up they plan to introduce them in March of this year. So keep an eye out for that. And this chart, which was taken, I think, from Deloitte from an EU Commission study, shows the phosphate imports into Europe on the left-hand side, some of the waste going, the losses in the gray, and then the small recycled portion in that purple. And the EU wants to expand that portion, the recycled portion, significantly. And of course, if you do that, then there will be less phosphate imports that are necessary. So that will also pressure the European market going forward. So moving even further west to the Americas, how much will the Americas import? I'm just going to go over the United States and Brazil, the two most important markets in the Americas. So as you can see, the Americas on the right-hand chart there has been importing significantly more phosphate since about 2013 or so. And this has to do with consolidations, downstream closures, the fact that the US is growing more soy to export into China. Also because Morocco and Saudi Arabia have increased capacity and they've been sending more product into the United States. So there's a variety of different reasons why. I don't have the forecast there shown to 2024, but we do expect it to significantly slow down. We don't expect so many downstream closures and consolidations as we have seen before. But of course, as OCP ramps up its capacity and introduces new capacity, which I'll talk about in a second, that may pressure imports up a little bit more. So this map just shows how much phosphate is coming into the U.S. and where it's coming from. Okay, so Brazil. Brazil has also been increasing its imports of phosphate over the last couple of years, actually for a long time. And this is driven by frontier agriculture as Brazil moves further and further into the Cerrado, the nutrient-poor regions of Brazil that produce very, very good crops. And so they need a lot of fertilizer, and they get it from all over the place, as you can see on the map there. And we expect this to continue because Brazil's agricultural fundamentals, its future agricultural fundamentals look very, very strong. Okay, so that's kind of a snapshot of what we think will happen over some of the main regions in the world. Let's go to capacities here. So I've got a lot on this chart here, but you have access to the slides, so you can take a look at it afterwards in detail if you'd like. I'll just kind of point out some of the major things that are happening. Up in Russia, those two yellowish dots there, those refer to Phosagro's capacity changes. So the first one is at Volkov, or otherwise called Metachem, and they plan to expand the phosphoric acid and MAP capacity there. At Balakovo, either they're going to expand their capacity or simply switch from MAP or perhaps their existing MP lines into NPKs. In China, there's a couple of more expansions, but there are also closures there. That's why we have that capacity decrease in the medium term. In India, PPL is thinking about expanding some of the phosphoric acid and DAP lines. Of course, in Egypt, we just had the EPC agreement concluded between WAFCO and a Chinese construction company, I think it is. In Saudi Arabia, we expect Modern 3 to come on at some point. It's in blue because we say it's speculative, but it's not really speculative. We just don't know all the exact details of it. We're pretty sure it's going to go forward. It's just getting the right details. And of course, OCP, we can't forget about that. And with respect to OCP, CRU paid a visit to OCP last November, and we saw construction of JPH units, so the Jorf-Lesfar hubs, units 5, 6, and 7 under construction. And each of these hubs will have 1 million ton of granular capacity, so that includes DAP, MAP, NPKs, perhaps TSPs, I'm not sure about that. But they will not have phosphoric acid unit phosphoric acids plants. So they're going to draw phosphoric acid from the rest of the Jorf-Lesfar complex. And we expect that these units will begin to commission about mid-2021, and then perhaps take a year, 2 years, perhaps 3 years for these to come online. So you can see that is part of the story of rising capacity at OCP over the medium term. And on the right-hand chart, we just show that there's still phosphate, despite the fact that these will not have standalone phosphoric acid capacities, that the phosphoric acid capacities will still rise because of efficiency gains and separate lines being commissioned. And this is just a snapshot of some of the major rock projects that are going on over the medium term. I just want to point out that the big one is at OCP once again, and this is OCP Hurgba Ulit Barris project. We expect maybe 2022, 2023 for it to commission, and this will be significant. So now I'm just going to summarize what I've been talking about in this presentation. So we expect over the medium term for global demand to rise faster, despite Chinese demand declines. Chinese exports will remain relatively stable. Indian imports will be continue to be driven by complex interactions, especially relative prices. In Europe, we expect more Russian NPKs and tighter environmental regulations. In the Americas, U.S. imports will continue to rise, but it won't rise at the same rate as from 2013 to 2018. We'll have growing Brazilian imports, and finally, OCP will lead the downstream and upstream capacity expansions. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I can take them now.